few moments ago, Mrs. Thatcher's government won an overwhelming vote of confidence in the Commons. But for the Prime Minister of the last 11 years, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Tonight, the key to 10 Downing Street lies in the hands of her party. She led them to victory 3 times, then they turned on her. Michael Heseltine's hopes of inheriting the crown now face the concerted attempts of the Cabinet to stop him. Good evening. Even now, over 12 hours on, you have to pinch yourself to realise it, but the Thatcher era is over. Tonight we ask what will replace it. In the short term, there's the fact that John Major and Douglas Hurd have entered the lists against Michael Heseltine.
And here at Westminster, Newsnight talks to the 3 camps with their hats in the ring for next Tuesday's ballot. I'll be talking to the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, who's now emerged as the favourite to beat Michael Heseltine. And I'll be asking campaign team leaders for Michael Heseltine and John Major what tactics they'll employ now.
And I'll be talking to influential voices from across the party. The Deputy Chairman, David Trippier, who said today that he's backing Michael Heseltine. Edwina Currie, who voted for Mr Heseltine in the first round, but may change her mind before next Tuesday. And Defence Minister Alan Clark, who says anyone who didn't vote for Mrs Thatcher is a coward.
And what's the political future beyond Thatcherism? Norman Tebbit, Labour's Margaret Beckett and Sir David Steele will be joining me to consider the wider implications. And we ask 2 distinguished apostles of conservatism, was the Thatcher Revolution no more than the Thatcher Revolt? Having watched Mrs Thatcher's performance in the House of Commons this afternoon, many Tory MPs are wondering what on earth they've done in getting rid of her. Bravura was the word Paddy Ashdown used, and if this was her last speech in Parliament, as most predict, the Thatcher era is ending with a bang. She dominated political life in Britain for over a decade, and when the Labour Party tabled its motion of no confidence this afternoon, she cast the rest of the Commons into the shade. A short time ago, the government comfortably defeated the opposition's no confidence motion by 367 votes to 247, a majority of 120. But to judge from her performance in the Commons, you'd never have guessed that at 7:30 this morning, Margaret Thatcher gave up the job which she believed to be her destiny. Having stepped aside from the leadership battle, Mrs Thatcher could face Mr Kinnock without any worries about opponents behind her. As expected, the leader of the opposition attacked the government's record on health, education and the poll tax. He then, in an increasingly boisterous atmosphere, set his sights on Europe, only to lose his way amidst repeated interruptions.
Secondly, they have to ensure that there is a growth orientation for the alternative. Is the stagflation? Yes. Oh, yes.
Mrs Thatcher dismissed Mr Kinnock's performance as windy and opaque. Her performance was as tough and uncompromising as ever.
No amount of distance lends enchantment to the lean years of Labour, which gave us the lowest growth rate in Europe, the highest strike record, and for the average family, virtually no increase in take-home pay. Labour's policies are a vote of no confidence in the ability of British people to manage their own affairs.
On Europe, the Prime Minister claimed that Mr Kinnock hadn't mastered the details of policy.
And on the central issues of Europe's future, they will not tell us where they stand. Do they want a single currency? The right honourable gentleman doesn't even know what it means or its consequences are present.
She assured her supporters she would remain active in the European debate and confidently fielded questions from all sides, some of which were answered for her.
Will she tell us whether she intends to continue her own personal fight against a single currency and an independent central bank when she leaves office?
No, she's going to be the governor.
On the present structure,
Order. The Prime Minister.
what a good idea.
Mrs Thatcher was now in her element.
I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this. Mr. Speaker, I was on.
You can wipe the floor with
I
these
was
people.
talking about Europe.
Indeed, on her day, Mrs. Thatcher could sweep all before her, and this was her day. And her enthusiasm was undiminished as she referred back to the Falklands and warned a war in the Gulf may not be far off.
When principles have to be defended, when good has to be upheld, when evil has to be overcome, then Britain will take up arms. It is because we on this side have never flinched from difficult decisions that this House and this country can have confidence in this government today.
Well, according to the Reuters news agency, at this morning's charged and emotional cabinet meeting, Mrs. Thatcher summed up her feelings with the words, "It's a funny old world." She was referring to the way the party she led to 3 election victories had spurned her. The new world into which the Tory party is now entering with 3 candidates for leader is pretty uncharted territory, with Michael Heseltine opposed by John Major and Douglas Hurd in a 3-horse race. To win outright, one of these candidates will have to poll more than 187 votes, a simple majority of the 372 Conservative MPs. Mr. Heseltine got 152 votes on the first ballot. His supporters believe Mr. Hurd and Mr. Major could split the Thatcher vote. But if no candidate passes the magical 187 mark, it will go to a 3rd ballot next Thursday. That'll take the form of the single transferable vote, much derided by the Tories for national elections. MPs will be asked to list their first and second preferences. If no candidate gets the necessary majority of 187 first preference votes, the candidate with the lowest vote will drop out, and his votes will then be redistributed according to the second preference of his supporters. So there will be a new Tory leader and Prime Minister next Tuesday or Thursday. This time last night, Cabinet Ministers were swearing blind that that leader would be Mrs. Thatcher. Yet by this morning, those very ministers had persuaded her to go. James Cox examines how it was done.
At sunrise, Peter Morrison, the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Private Secretary, arrived at Downing Street. She had already made up her mind. The Cabinet assembled at 9 a.m. to hear her decision. At 9:39, a press association flash announced the news to the world.
It's a very sad day. She's done a tremendous job for the country, and she has decided in the best interest of the country, the government and the party that it would be best for her to stand down.
At 12:40, she left Downing Street to go to the palace to inform the Queen in person. And at 3:15, Mrs. Thatcher rose in the House of Commons to answer Prime Minister's questions, though, as she told the House, it wouldn't be quite the last time.
May I remind the House that I expect to be here on Tuesday afternoon and possibly even on Thursday afternoon. So I hope the House will be as kind then as it is today.
For if the leadership election goes to a 3rd ballot, there won't be a new leader or Prime Minister until a week tonight. But what was the decisive factor that finally persuaded her to change her mind? Last night, she met, one by one, all her 21 cabinet colleagues. According to Newsnight sources, a massive majority, including some of her staunchest supporters, advised her she should quit. Some, like Kenneth Clarke and Chris Patten, bluntly told her it was time to go with honour. Others, like Michael Howard and Peter Lilly, said they would support her if she decided to go on, but they had reluctantly concluded that the game was up. Our information is that, setting aside Douglas Hurd and John Major, 17 out of the 19 ministers told her she was likely to lose a straight contest against Michael Heseltine. Only Cecil Parkinson and Northern Ireland Secretary Peter Brook urged her to fight on.
Well, I'm very saddened that the Prime Minister's going to cease to be Prime Minister. She's been a great Prime Minister. I believe she could have carried on being, and I've been trying to persuade her to do so, but I lost that particular argument.
What were the arguments, do you think, which did persuade her finally that it was time to go?
There was only one, and it was the argument that she couldn't win, and that a person representing her views and her policies, rather than her views, her policies, could. So she stepped aside to let John Major or Douglas Hurd win.
Certainly, there were an overwhelming number who said, you're not going to win. And I think one or two of those messages were given in very emotional terms because there was an enormous amount of affection for her from those cabinet ministers.
But if the message was so clear, why did Mrs. Thatcher keep her party in turmoil for more than 36 hours after she was mortally wounded in the first ballot?
I think some of the blame must go to those so-called men in grey suits and some of her own cabinet colleagues who perhaps were too timid to tell her the truth. The rumblings in the party, the divisiveness, had been building up for a long time, not just in the parliamentary party, not just in the cabinet, but in the country as a whole. And I think those that advise her should have had a little more guts in advising her more frankly. But perhaps Margaret is the sort of person who would rather shoot the messenger than hear the message, and so perhaps some of the blame must fall on her as well.
It seems clear that Mrs. Thatcher's decision to resign was inspired by one principal aim: to stop Michael Heseltine. She knew there were others ready to enter the fray, but only if she stood down.
I can believe that I can unite the party in handling present problems and in winning the next general election.
I would like the opportunity of trying to unite the party. A lot of colleagues have suggested to me that I may be able to do so, and so I have decided to let my name go forward in the ballot for leadership of the Conservative Party.
This is a tactical move by the anti-Heseltine forces. They're concerned that with the momentum given him by the first ballot, Mr. Heseltine could beat either Mr. Hurd or Mr. Major in a straight fight. But if both stand, the theory is, they'll attract enough support from various wings of the party to deny anyone a simple majority on the second ballot, and then on the third ballot, votes can be traded between the Hurd and Major camps to deny Mr. Heseltine the prize. So how do cabinet loyalties divide in this new landscape? Douglas Hurd was nominated by Tom King and seconded by Chris Patten. So far, he's also endorsed by Kenneth Clarke, William Waldegrave and Malcolm Rifkind. John Major has been proposed by Norman Lamont and seconded by John Gummer. Lining up behind him so far are Michael Howard and Peter Lilly. But why are Mrs. Thatcher and the rest of the cabinet so concerned about the prospect of a Heseltine victory?
I think it is quite a difficult thing for a party in government to shift direction to the extent of electing someone from outside the inner policy circle. I was working for Ted Heath when the last change took place. Now, we were in opposition then, and it didn't matter that it took 3 or 4 years, which it did, to realign the party in a new direction. You can't realign the party in a new direction a year before a general election. It must be one of those who has been part of the current policy, who has been taking the policy forward, and luckily we have 2 extremely good candidates in Douglas and John.
Mrs. Thatcher will soon be an ex-Prime Minister, but her influence lingers on. She wants to ensure not only that the succession stays within the cabinet, but more importantly that her legacy, Thatcherism, is kept alive. And the key to the succession may well lie with her natural supporters, the right wing. They can muster perhaps 80 votes. And with no obvious right-wing candidate, much will depend on how that bloc manoeuvres and what commitments it can exact.